the newsroom. Yes, banks are back in the news. The chair of Britain's largest private lender, HSBC, apologizing this Tuesday before a U.S. Senate subcommittee over money laundering in places like Mexico and Iran. The lax oversight from 2004 to 2010 continued long after the financial crisis had erupted. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, another panel, another scandal, this one involving banking. The chair of the Bank of England admitting he only became aware 2 weeks ago that the folks at Barclays had tried to rig interbank lending rates. Only 2 weeks ago, even though Mervyn King had raised fears over LIBOR with the man who would become the U.S. Treasury Secretary, Timothy Geithner, who was then head of the New York Fed back in 2008. It's not just money laundering and rate fixing. The International Herald Tribune reports this Tuesday on how banks regularly give sneak peeks of company assessments to the largest hedge funds, tantamount, some might say, to insider trading. So how unbridled are the banks? Today in the France 24 debate, we look at why 5 years on, finance still seems out of control to many. With us, Thierry Philipponnat, Secretary General of Finance Watch, based out of Brussels, but here in Paris today. Thank you for being with us. Also with us, Marcus Carlson, our France 24 business editor. Welcome back, sir. And joining us from London, Ronald Freeman of the Atlantic Council, who is not in London, but in Albi, in the southwest of France. A nice place to be to watch the world. The France 24 debate, where you can always weigh in on the conversation on Facebook and Twitter. You can find us at François F24. Now, when that Senate hearing opened on Capitol Hill this Tuesday, the panel released a scathing report denouncing a, quote, pervasively polluted culture at HSBC. A lot of the attention on its Mexico affiliate. The report says that Mexico business had a branch in the Cayman Islands that in 2008 handled 50,000 client accounts and $2.1 billion in holdings, but had no staff or offices. It also shipped banknotes by car or aircraft to the HSBC in the U.S. This isn't some shady bank from some obscure part of the world we're talking about. Thierry Philipponnat, we're talking about HSBC.
Yes. Talking about major bank, and that's the whole problem, because beyond HSBC, we're talking about a system problem. I mean, the problem is the structure of the banking business.
But does it surprise you that HSBC had $2.1 billion in holdings and no staff in its bank in Cayman Islands?
It doesn't surprise me, because that's the whole issue about tax havens. And we all know that in theory there's no such thing as tax havens anymore in this world. You know, we see the reports from the G20 saying, you know, look at the OECD list, and the list is more or less empty. The reality is that the tax evasion business has never been as big. And guess who does that? I mean, the banks do it. So, you know, there's no surprise. HSBC in this case got caught. But, you know, most banks do the same thing. So, you know, there's money laundering as such. And, you know, it's difficult for me to comment on someone who cheated or did something illegal. But the fact is that the business of evading taxes in tax havens is something which is systematically done by the vast majority of banks.
Marcus Carlson, this is like a double whammy. It was Britain's second largest bank a couple of weeks ago. We'll talk more about the LIBOR scandal in a moment. And now this going on at HSBC. And again, the timeline of it, 2004 to 2010.
Yes, it seems as if this went on for quite some time at HSBC. And just to tie in your point there, that HSBC is no small name, and it is Europe's biggest bank after all. It's based in the UK, and then you have Barclays, of course, in second place. And it seems as if this went on for years and years and years. For instance, back in 2007, 2008, there were warnings from US authorities as well as Mexican authorities that $7 billion was moved from the Mexican operations of HSBC to the US operations of HSBC. And the Mexican and US authorities, they both warned HSBC that this money was probably tied to the drugs cartels in Mexico. So, as you say, this went on for quite some time, and no one seemed to be ringing the alarm bell. And that was once again something that we heard during the Senate hearing today, this Tuesday. Senators asked HSBC officials and executives time and time again, why did you not ring the bell? Because you did see the evidence after all. And it seems as if they basically came up short. They did come up short when it comes to providing the senators with an actual answer. They were dumbfounded. No one could actually provide an answer.
HSBC may just be an example. That's what says says the panel, the chair panel of that Senate subcommittee.
Accountability for past conduct is essential, and that's what's been missing here. It's bad enough that a single bank, such as HSBC, exposes the U.S. financial system to multiple money laundering risks. It's made worse when there's a failure of anti-money laundering oversight by the regulator, which is supposed to oversee our biggest banks.
Ronald Freeman, what shocks you more, the fact that all this went on at HSBC, or the fact you just heard Marcus Carlson say it, that they were warned? But is it up to the banks to clean up their act, or is it up to a higher authority to do it for them?
Well, Francois, let's look back to the 90s when Alan Greenspan, Bob Rubin, and Larry Summers ganged up on Brooksley Born of the CFTC. You'll remember that Brooksley wanted to regulate derivatives. And Greenspan and his colleagues said that any intervention in the markets would be disastrous. The markets are perfect. They are self-correcting. Regulators with their clumsy hands must not touch them. Let's remember when GlassSteagall was abolished at the end of the 90s. Some of the same congressmen who are sounding so severe with their chastisements on these panels, not just of HSBC, but of Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, and many others, were among those applauding, relieving the market from the heavy and outmoded hand of GlassSteagall. So the pendulum has finally started to swing back the other way.
But the pendulum seems to be swinging very slowly. I want to welcome at this point Fabrice Simon of Lutetia Capital, based here in Paris. Thank you for being with us as well here on our panel in the France 24 debate. HSBC, is it just the one bank, or is this a problem industry-wide when it comes to looking the other way, when it comes to large sums of cash, in this case to places like Mexico and Iran?
Well, I don't know the specifics of HSBC, but it is clear that there was a long-lasting system since a couple of decades, and it is true that some financial institutions took advantage sometimes of a lack of regulation or light regulation, maybe too light, and therefore try to put some money in certain pockets in certain countries. But it's changing, clearly. If you see, for example, Switzerland. Switzerland has long lived for decades with offshore money, and it's clearly changing. But the problem at the end of the day is that with regulation should be global, because what you really don't want to have is an uneven playing field and just to put the problem somewhere else, which is exactly what's happening right now.
Certainly, you heard Ronald Freeman, you heard there Fabrice talk about how the pendulum is swinging the other way when it comes to keeping an eye on what banks do. Mm-hmm. But how fast is that pendulum swinging? Are we just reporting on it, or is there really change inside the banks?
Inside the banks, I'm not convinced. In the regulation landscape, there's been many things happening. There's been many pieces of regulation that have been put in place or that are being discussed at EU level or in the US at the moment. The problem is that we are addressing a number of true issues, but we're addressing 5% of what needs to be addressed, because the most fundamental issues is, at the end of the day, what sort of banking structure do we want? What sort of banking world do we want? Do we want a banking system that serves the needs of society and of the economy, and that does not put society at risk when it fails? Do we want banks to be manageable Financial Times this morning was speaking about banks that have become too large to be trusted, and not that long ago another column was speaking about banks too big to manage. Not too big to fail, too big to manage. Too big to fail, we know the debate. But now we're talking about too big to manage. I mean, perfect illustration of that was the JP Morgan case. You have Jamie Dimon, who's been saying about that CIO loss that is somewhere between $2 and $7 billion. Nobody seems to know. That he didn't know until very recently that was happening. Either we have a system problem because, you have the CEO of a well-managed or supposedly well-managed large bank who doesn't know about such a big issue, or we have a problem of competence. But, how can we deal with that? I mean, we have to address those issues. And, when you have banks employing hundreds of thousands of employees, is that still manageable? I mean, that's a big issue. When you have banks whose balance sheet size is the size of 100% or 150% of local GDP, domestic GDP of the country, the host country where they're based, is that still manageable? That's the biggest issues we're facing, and that is only addressed in a very, very limited manner for the time being.
All right, it's only addressed in a limited manner. We heard a minute ago Ronald Freeman mention the repeal of what was called the GlassSteagall Act. Can you explain what that means for Marcus Carlson?
Well, I think the main point now is the fact that there just seems to be these massive banks, as you were just referring to, and
who do both investment and retail banking.
Absolutely, and that is something that has been brought up, and it was brought up last year, for instance, in the Vickers Commission in the United Kingdom. It was looking into whether or not you should actually ring fence the so-called retail sector of banks from the investment banking operations of these massive banks. And I suppose that debate to a certain extent could probably be revived by this latest revelation about HSBC and in relation to the GlassSteagall Act, indeed, because these retail banks or these massive banks shouldn't really have the power to move around their money in such a haphazard way. I was referring before to money being moved from the Mexican operations of HSBC into the US operations of HSBC, and no one really seems to have had the oversight. And this is something that the HSBC executives talked about in the hearing this Tuesday. They said that perhaps we are hamstrung by the fact that our banks are just too large, that the structure of these banks, they're quite decentralized, especially HSBC, which is based in London, but with operations all across the world. Its tagline once used to be the world's local bank. So it has a very decentralized structure. And also HSBC executives, they were referring to the fact that there's been rapid expansion over the past few years, and that once again perhaps is a problem, or probably is a problem, because there's little or no oversight.
Fabrice Simon?
Yes, I just want to distinguish again, we're not exactly all of us familiar with the HSBC case, but I think we should distinguish on one hand the tax evasion that might have been pushed forward by banks like UBS scandal in Switzerland again, and on the other hand the fact that they're doing prop trading and sometimes they are doing mistakes. And again, they're a bit through thick and thin because those banks are in between the interest of their clients in any company. You were referring to large corporation of 100,000 employees. Even if you are a tire manufacturer, whatever your business is, the first interest you have to protect are your clients. So in a way,
even when it means again,
no,
putting $2.1 billion in assets in the Cayman Islands and not having any staff in the bank. We know what that's about.
Again, I'm not talking about criminal activities. I'm talking about tax evasion. It is true that banks actually push forward tax evasion for the interest of their clients, and in a way they were not there to protect the interest of the states, but they were there to protect their own businesses and their clients' interest. And that's what I want to distinguish, because again there is a big of a confusion between criminal activities on one side and tax evasion on the other one that was very tolerated until recent years, and right now it's obviously intolerable because of the state of public finances.
And again, a lot of that money going through the Cayman Islands. David Bigley, the compliance executive at HSBC, stepping down over the scandal. He told so to that committee. He went beyond an apology, promising to close thousands of HSBC accounts in the Cayman Islands. His boss getting a grilling over the time it took to put out the fire.
Is there any way that should have been allowed to have happened? Forget the business case and anything else. Is there any way that should have been allowed to happen at the time?
No, Senator.
All right, and there was no good answer to that one. Ronald Freeman, what do you think is going to happen now? We've seen these panels a lot. In part two, we'll be talking about the panel that's taking place across the Atlantic over in the UK involving Barclays. What happens after one of these congressional panels?
Act one, I think, François, will be finger pointing across the Atlantic. The grilling of HSBC follows on the somewhat more tender treatment of Lloyd Blankfein of Goldman Sachs when he appeared before congressional panels. And unlike HSBC, Lloyd Blankfein did not apologize. In fact, he said Goldman Sachs was doing God's work when it was selling to its customers packages of mortgages that Goldman Sachs itself was shorting and telling each other were not worth the paper they were printed on. So we will see a period in which there's a finger-pointing recrimination. Congresswoman Caroline Maloney of New York recently told me that the concern in Washington was that regulation in London was too light compared to regulation in the United States. She did not characterize U.S. regulation in that conversation. So there will be a period of finger-pointing. Whether anything will actually happen, it will perhaps, if people like yourselves keep the pressure on through well-focused publicity, legislators may finally be obliged to do something and ignore the lobbyists. The financial industry is one of the strongest lobbyists in Washington, and they have resisted successfully many efforts in the past to curb their excesses.
And when we come back, we'll be looking at the scandal on rate fixing across the Atlantic, one which, by the way, might hit HSBC as well. You're watching the France 24 debate.